Morning, everyone. I'm Mark Cooper, and welcome to this morning's webinar from Act Renewable. Thank you all for making the time to join us. I can see a lot of people online and really good attendance, so we will get straight into things. The focus of this morning's presentation is all about the strategic and practical approach to corporate sourcing. So really relevant to corporations of all sizes across different markets and geographies. A lot of focus, as most of you will have seen in the media, on the likes of Google, Apple, Amazon, and their commitment to go 100% renewable by various different dates. I think for a lot of businesses, it may be more difficult to relate to those kind of larger, more mega corporations in terms of goals, requirements, resources, and finances. So this morning's presentation is kind of very much on the practical steps that I guess maybe that next tier of corporations can take to benefit from sourcing renewables and how to begin that journey. So in terms of a loose agenda, we will get straight into the presentation, which will last 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have a similar amount of time for some questions and discussions at the end. So I'll hand straight over to Rasmus Nedergaard, Managing Director of Act Renewable, who will take us through the presentation. Morning, Rasmus.
Good morning, Mark.
Rasmus, did you want to start with a quick intro to yourself? And obviously, in terms of your corporate background, is going to be highly relevant for a lot of people listening in today.
Yeah. So my background is that I come from the corporate side and has worked more than 10 years on helping corporations sort of from the inside of the corporates to transition into renewable energy. So that is why I was engaged with Act Renewable, and that is what we're trying to help now accelerate across a larger number of corporates around the world. And thanks for the intro, Mark. I'm glad that we see many people online today, and I'm looking forward to share our views on how corporates can transition into renewables and what the first steps could be. And at the same time, looking forward to hopefully have some good questions and at the end, so we can try and make it as concrete as possible. Now I can't move the slides. Here we go. Yeah, so Act Renewable is on a journey. Getting to renewables in terms of corporates is something that we help them transition and really realize the full potential that is available for the corporates. Shortly on who Act Renewable is, we're a purebred consultancy company helping corporates basically transition into renewables. The company was originally founded by Biowa RE and Reset Carbon about 2 years ago. And we believe that accelerating the corporate renewable energy transition is really key to reducing the global greenhouse gas emissions at a rate that is required to meet the Paris Agreement that many companies and corporates have signed up to. So let's sort of get into the weeds. I'm gonna do a little quiz here, or you can quiz, even though you're all on mute, by looking at some data. Some of them you may recognize, but let's try and see if we can sort of set the stage and get it right. I think the first one is quite easy for everyone. What we're of course aiming at is to try and keep the temperature rise at the end of the century below 1.5 degrees as an average. And one of the major contributors to that is energy and power in particular. Consumption that generates a lot of carbon dioxide, which basically create our climate on the planet to increase. And that's what we will try to avoid to the extent possible, of course. The next piece here, 60%. 60% is actually the amount of energy globally that has a corporate as the end consumer. So the corporate space, whether it being manufacturing or retail, is actually one of the major consumers of energy, and therefore also one of the largest emitters in the world as a super sector, if you will. Unfortunately, only 200 companies, according to the RE100, has signed up to the RE100 campaign, which is a pledge to go 100% renewable. And obviously 200 companies sounds like a lot, but if you think about that, how many there is out there, there's still a long, long way to go. And the next number, 21, is actually reflecting the number of corporate power purchase agreement deals that has been signed in Europe year to date this year, 2019. And I don't have a reference on it, but I know that about half of them are actually signed by Google. So that means that one of the instruments that we will be looking to in the future to actually be able to deliver corporate renewables at scale, I would say have only generated around 20 deals in 2019, which I think is a bit low compared to what I had expected, to be honest. The next number is a bit more difficult, I think, for most people, but what it actually reflects is the 21,372 is the terawatt hours that in 2017 was consumed in terms of power in the world. Of those, only 465 terawatt hours was actually renewable energy consumed by corporates. So again, if you look back at the 60% that the corporate world is consuming, and here we are looking at about a 2% renewable electricity consumption, there is a long, long way to go for the corporate world to actually accelerate to the point that it generates enough that we can safely go to the 1.5 degrees. Now, times 2 is actually that within the next 10 years, according to ERA, the electricity consumption globally is going to increase from around 21,000 terawatt hours to around 40,000 terawatt hours. So there is a long way to go. And just to add to that, that if the 200 corporate members of the RE100 were to deliver on their targets by 2025, if they've said that would only add around 260 terawatt hours additionally. So the message here is basically that if we're ever going to get to a 60% cover, we need to be sure that more than just the RE100 companies are actually accelerating. The last number, 4%, is a good one because that's actually the price that solar PV is decreasing year over year. It makes the business case for renewables actually progress quite fast. So prices are coming down and therefore making it much more attractive. The challenges of renewable transition is could be one of the reasons why this is not progressing. And of course, we will make sure to give you a bit of an answer to how this can be overcome in the next couple of slides. But I think it's important that corporates understand their challenges and basically try to identify which ones are the ones that are most relevant for them and what they are able to recognize in their own business. But generally, a few examples of what we normally hear is that renewable energy is too difficult and complex for companies to engage in. Companies for whom energy is not a top priority or a top spend on their procurement list finds it's very complex and complicated and time consuming. The business models that they are presented to are quite immature and they don't reflect the corporate's needs. The business models like PPAs that are out there today are by some corporates perceived as being very much in favor of the developers and the investors rather than being tailored to actually meet the risks that the corporates are facing in their energy procurement. The opportunities and feasibilities varies a lot from country to country, which makes a simple approach challenging across a global portfolio. Many companies are present across Europe, US, Asia, South America, and even within countries that are bordering each other in certain parts of the world, the opportunities and the feasibility, the legislation can be very, very different. And therefore it is quite detailed and difficult to get that overview to really understand what options are available. Energy policy is complex. Once you go in and start looking at long-term procurement of renewable energy, the least thing you want to be faced with is instability in the political landscape. And that's something that, especially in Southeast Asia, where a lot of corporates have massive carbon footprints, is daily business. Renewables are expensive. It's a bit of an odd comment, but you know, some corporates believe that's the case, even though it may not be, and that is based on that they have maybe not looked into the right opportunities, or they are actually perceiving it being very expensive because they've been used to just procuring black energy at the very lowest rate available. Corporates, compliance and good governance guidelines set out by NGOs and different reporting bodies are limiting the opportunities for the corporates to pursue renewable energy, where topics like proximity is actually more important than additionality. And the last one here is that transparency and credibility of renewable products, technologies can be very difficult to evaluate what is good and what is bad, or is there such a thing as a good renewable source or a bad renewable source? Does that really have to do with the criteria that you as a company are laying down? So these are just examples. There are many more, but these are just examples of the challenges that we believe is actually hindering that transition that we were looking at on the previous slide, that is so important that we need to accelerate in order to actually get this moving forward. What we've done here is that we've actually tried to structure the challenges a little bit, because we believe that most corporates are facing the same types of challenges, the same types of complexity as they're moving along towards their end goal of renewables. And the first one that we have identified is what we call the business case. It is really about ensuring that the business understands their footprint, they understand their strategy, their company strategy, and that they focus on identifying a renewable approach that fits their business, instead of going out and trying to do like everyone else. Because having that internal support, having that understanding of why renewables is a good opportunity for your company is key to get this through from an internal side. The second area of complexity that we are looking at is the technology piece. You could say it's a bit more of an external piece. Corporates may want to do things in a certain way, but the availability of such a product, being, for instance, PPAs that we've already talked about, is actually only available in a very limited number of countries around the world. So if the strategy is to do PPAs, it's going to be very difficult. So in this case, corporates have to take a much more diversified approach to renewables and really understand what is available for them and what is not only available but feasible for them in certain regions and countries around the world. The last piece here, which is becoming increasingly interesting, if we go 10 years back, most of the corporates that were looking at renewable energy were doing direct investments themselves. But what we're seeing right now, and especially with the financial markets around the world at the moment, there is a lot of capital available for financing renewable energy, as it is, especially wind and solar, is actually perceived as being quite safe investments. And therefore, a lot of different financing opportunities like leasing models, power purchase agreement deal, or even direct investments is actually coming along. So you as a corporate do actually have a choice. In order to go renewable doesn't mean that you have to spend a lot of money up front, i.e. focus on the CapEx. There are different OpEx opportunities available as well. Or the other way around, if you really want to spend your money in a good place and you have something in access to spend on renewables, for instance, there are options as well. So this is how we've defined, and these questions basically pops up all the way along this path, or this roadmap that we have laid out here. So what we've done here is really identified 5 crucial steps on the way for corporates to go renewable. And corporates may find themselves at different stages here, but what we will do is we'll try and go a little bit deeper on what is it actually that the corporates have to do at the different levels. And we're also seeing, unfortunately, sometimes the corporates sort of jump this line, move to a strategy before they have the commitment, and normally that means that their plans gets rejected, at least internally at some stage, or become too expensive because they haven't really done the groundwork from the beginning. So if you look at the insight piece is really about understanding your global footprint of your operations. It's about making sure that you know where your energy consumption is, where you're based, even map the renewable energy related challenges and opportunities that your businesses have from a high level perspective, and make sure that it is aligned with your company strategy. I think a good example is that if your company doesn't have a lot of capital available, it's something that quite easily makes it obvious that a OPEX model potentially is more prevailing. So we don't have to go all the way to the strategy element to decide on that. You can actually lay that down quite clearly very early stage. And the same thing if you're based in mainly in Southeast Asia, well, there are certain technologies, there are certain things that is not available for you the same way as it would be had your main business been in Europe or the US. Around commitment, this commitment has actually been spelled out in a survey from 2017 by PwC, that more than 60% of all sustainability professionals sees the internal engagement or the internal support as being the major inhibitor for a renewable transition. So I can only say, I can't say it enough, I mean, gaining the commitment from internal business stakeholders is really important. And that means that taking the company strategy, understanding how the company works is really key. And then based on that, develop a prioritized set of company specific decision criteria, understand what the drivers for your business is in terms of going into renewables. Is it a brand perspective? Is it cost reductions? Is it emission reductions? Is it that you want to be perceived as a renewable company, i.e. a very sort of on-site driven approach? What is it? There is no good or bad here. It's just about making sure that you fully understand what these criteria are and use it. And a good way to do that is to do it through a very thorough risk assessment. So you basically put the right people in the room, fully understand, and help them understand what the risk of renewables and even opportunities for renewables are for your business. Now, sort of the big chunk here is setting the strategy right. And as you've probably seen, at this stage, I haven't even mentioned a target yet, because you need to understand where you want to go and how you want to go before you can go out and set a target. I'll get back to that in a second. But understanding the different renewable technologies and products and how it applies to your business in the countries of presence is a mapping exercise that's quite important to do, at least understanding what's available. Back to the example that if you have done the majority of your business in the US and you have been happily applying power purchase agreements for renewable energy, you would get stuck in parts of Europe and definitely in Asia because those products are not available. And therefore, having that understanding allows you to create your strategy at the end. So in combination with the decision-making criteria, that understanding of your technology applicability will actually inform your strategy at the end. And then at the end, set realistic renewable energy target. Don't fall into the pit where you, because somebody else has said that we want to do 2025, your company should by default do 2024 because you want to be better and faster. Renewable energies in many parts of the world is still a developing business. That's not only in terms of technology, where we could look at storage and hydrogen as examples, but it's also the political landscape. So you may end up in a situation that if you go very aggressively out with a target, that you won't meet it. And sometimes it's better to be realistic than be quick and fast. The last piece here on the implementation is developing the roadmap. The roadmap is really your plan for execution. It is guided by your strategy and it has to be allowed for changes because the roadmap would potentially be structured for 10, 15 years. So you got to be open to change when legislation change, opportunities in certain countries potentially pop up. or prices develops in a positive way, well, that changes your prioritization, of course. And therefore, the roadmap should be, you could say, a living document, but should always be guided by the strategy as you move along. And then make sure that you get some successes. Start with the lowest hanging fruits. If you have opportunities to deliver emission reductions in certain countries, which may not be as sexy as others, I would still suggest that you do it, because it is that momentum that's going to prove your case and actually potentially even gain you savings that you can use to finance other transition elements at a later stage. From now, I'm going to move on to looking at some of the technologies, some of the key technologies that we'll be doing. I am aware that the next slides here. Oh, sorry, I forgot this one. Sorry about that. There is one piece missing. It's the realization. The realization is really about centralizing and structured procurement. We're seeing a lot of companies at the moment that are trying to do renewable energies at a global scale by asking their decentralized functions to actually drive this procurement transition. But because it is so complex, it is something we generally recommend that you take a structured or centralized approach, and then of course report on progress being very important. And now to a few of the technologies. We're going to run through 4 different technologies quite quickly. I know they're very complex, and there may be people joining here that thinks this is really just skimming them through, but it is really not to talk about the technologies and the technicalities of it. It's really to get to the point of what are the characteristics of those, and how can you see yourself potentially investing or addressing certain type of technologies. PPAs, that is one of the buzzwords at the moment. Everybody talks about it. Unfortunately, very few are able to execute them. Back to the 21 deals made in Europe this year, where the tech gigantics, I think we can call them giants, like Google, Microsoft, Facebook are actually signing most of those deals at the moment. But basically, it is just an electricity supply agreement between 2 parties. It is almost implicit that it has to be about renewables. Actually, it doesn't. There are a lot of power purchase agreements out there that is just a procurement of energy. But in case of renewables, it does describe the agreement between a renewable energy power plant owner or generator and then an off-taker. And within that setup, there is a certificate, which I'll get back to in a minute, but it basically means that there is a direct link between the generator of a renewable asset and the green attributes that follows along directly to the off-taker. The example you're seeing on your right side of the screen right now is what we call the on-site PPA type. It is really simple. The generator owns and operates a plant, sells the electricity to the off-taker, even though it's on the rooftop, and the payment goes the other way. Pretty simple. The next one here is a physical PPA. It requires that it is basically on the same grid, but there is sometimes utility in between. In most cases, there is utility in between, where the generator feeds the power into a grid, whether it is a local grid or it is a specific grid designed only to supply your asset. And then there is direct payment between the 2 parties. And then I think the one that is the most talk of the town is the virtual PPA, where you basically generate your renewable energy in one grid, feed it into the grid. The off-taker basically consumes energy from a different grid, but there is an electricity payment that runs between the off-taker and the generator. And what happens here is quite clearly that you need to understand that there's going to be something about prices, where the off-taker price could be one and the generator price could be another one. So there is an electricity payment contract that deals with those differences. I'm not going to spend more time on this now. We can always do it. I want to get to this piece here, which actually touches on some of the characteristics. And as this presentation will be available online afterwards, I'm not going to touch on every one, but basically say that the characteristics of the PPA is that it's rather complex and time intensive to negotiate. It has usually long-term agreements if we're talking about new assets or long-term PPAs between 7 to 20 years, depending on where in the world you are. It is fundamentally hedging against energy price. So if you have a saving on a PPA setup, it has to do with that you are either betting against an energy price or somebody's guaranteeing you a price which is below the energy price on the market or the electricity price on the market. The PPA is in most cases, except for the on-site version, something which happens outside of your site. So it doesn't add much to the flavor of renewables, even though it actually has high additionality if it's a new asset, and it's very scalable, which is why it is one of the most important instruments, hopefully in the future, because it can be built out to actually cover the majority of the energy, renewable energy supply demand. The next one is the energy attribute certificates. And what we're going to talk about here is very much the unbundled version. Usually when a renewable energy is produced, it generates your electrons as power. At the same time, it generates a certificate. Now, sometimes these certificates can be traded unbundled, and this is what we're going to focus on here. Because what that does as you as a corporate, that it allows you to procure a renewable energy project, in most cases with a guarantee of origin, which allows you to say that I have now bought 1 megawatt of renewable energy from a specific asset produced at a specific time. Now, there's a lot of certificates in the market, and they vary a lot depending on where in the world you are. Below at the EAC types, you can see we have the ones in Europe called the GOOs, North America, the RECs, Southeast Asia, you've got the TIGRIS, and then you've got an international renewable energy certificate called the IREX. Fundamental for all of these is that you can't transition from one scheme into another, but in some cases you can actually transfer certificate generated in one country to another country, which is something that's quite interesting in terms of how you can aggregate at a later stage. The characteristics of the EACs is that it is a OPEX-driven approach. It is always on top of your energy prices, so you procure energy as you've always done, and then you procure your unbundled EACs on the top. It's a fast solution. It is a solution that makes it scalable, and the way I normally look at it is that you can use it to buffer up against your electricity consumption. So if your electricity consumption year to year is fluctuating, it is a really good thing to use EACs to buffer that last piece. On the other hand, as you're paying for your certificates every year, it is not a good business case in itself. It will always be an additional cost. And there may be some issues in terms of the quality. You can set high requirements to the certificate, so you can make sure that they are additional, that they're from new assets, that they're generated in the same country as where you're consuming your energy. And every time you say add something on it, the price on the certificate usually goes up. And in some cases, these very high quality certificates are not even available. On-site solutions, I think, is more simple to address. Most of you guys are probably familiar with it. We've set on-site solutions because we would like to accommodate how hydrogen, for instance, will be implemented. Very few companies have also looked into on-site wind, but in most cases, on-site solutions, at least in 2019, refers to solar photovoltaic energy. Even though those are quite simple on the roof of or next to a facility, there are different options. There is the direct investment where you as a corporate are spending your money to invest in it and have somebody potentially to operate it on behalf of you. There is a leasing opportunity where you lease out your roof to someone else to actually have an asset on your premises, and then at the end you basically you procure the energy off the plant. And then finally you got the on-site PPAs, which is somewhat similar to the leasing model. The only difference is that the terms are different, and in the leasing case the asset will be on your balance sheet, which it will not be if it's a PPA setup. The characteristic here that it is very visible. It is unfortunately not scalable because you have your limitations of space being the largest inhibitor. It is highly additional, and but it usually only covers a fraction of the electricity demand. And for most corporates, that for a manufacturing facility, it sits somewhere between 10 and 20%. So, i.e., you need other things to actually generate the bulk of the renewable energy you want to consume if you want to go to 100%. It's easy to understand, and yeah, it does have a return on the investment if you choose the own consumption. Last one being the green tariffs. We've included the green tariff here because it is applicable within the Area 100. What it basically is that it's a utility that procures renewable energy from a generator, and then they pool all the certificates. So you, as the corporate, buys a green product where somebody else is retiring the actual certificates on behalf of you. What that means is, I usually see it as a blender, is that you put a lot of different green opportunities into a blender and then you turn it on. And then what you get out is a green but very mixed product. I'm sure there are utilities out there that actually offers sort of more, that could be a green wind product. But here in Germany, where Act Renewable is based, we have products like Grünstrom, which is basically a green product where there are certificates behind, but you don't have an influence on whether you're buying solar, wind, or new or old assets, and you don't get access to the EACs. The characteristics here is usually that the costs are low. There are even countries in the world where this is just given away almost for free because they have a lot of hydro, as an example. It doesn't have any impact on your building. It has pretty low complexity, and it works very well with general energy procurement. It's not available everywhere, and there are some people out there believing that the additionality and the actual sort of greenness of such a product is questionable. I wouldn't judge that, but just let you know that that's the case. Now back to the strategy piece, how to build the strategy. I'm going to go through these steps quite quickly, as we've already touched upon some of them. It is really about understanding your footprint, understanding your consumption emission, your energy type, countries and legislation, and the technology pros and cons. So a mapping at this stage is normally required to be able to move forward. And then understanding your internal decision-making criteria, how to engage your stakeholders, understand what drives their engagement, and what the criteria hierarchy is. Is price more important than emission reductions, or is it the other way around? That is important. And then there is the time and price scenarios. Investigate the different cost scenarios. Do you understand what it will take you basically to go renewable if you're only going to use EACs? Do you understand what that's going to cost you over 10 years compared to if you did an initial investment? I think it's important at this stage to operate this very professionally and actually lay forward the different price scenarios that a corporate has, rather than just believing that it's possible to get this through as because this is good and this is what we need to do. I think it's required. And then finally, understanding the influence on the timeline. So the different scenarios that you're looking at will have a prescript bespoke timeline associated with it. Then we're ready to set the ambition levels. Some companies want to be leader of the industry, or at least just make sure that they're in a good position. That, of course, informs how aggressively your target setting should be. And I think at this stage, we have at least experienced that doing some kind of a benchmark, understanding who you're measuring up against and what your general appetite on this is quite important before we move into develop a target. And to repeat myself, be ambitious but realistic. Do not engage in a battle for higher and faster. And I would say go slow to move fast. Understand all the other stuff before you go out and set a target. We have seen the past couple of months there are a few CEOs who've been out there and claiming renewables really quickly. I would say that it's good for engagement, but it may not be a very sustainable solution. I would personally prefer that corporates understand the situation before they go out and actually generate a target. It could very well be that you can make a very ambitious target at a good price and transition roadmap. So, and then know your roadmap to success, understand your plan, what it costs, and be fact-based about it. So back to the challenge. Let's see if we can fix this equation here by looking ahead. The good news is that technologies are in a good position to deliver the required energy. DNVGL just published their annual renewable transition report, or energy transition report, where it basically states that all the technologies to actually do this is in place, and the price levels are now on grid parity. So renewables is not any more expensive than other sources, but it's the scaling of it that is the challenge, and it's the adaptation. The business case is good and it's getting better. So it means that there's going to be capital available almost everywhere. There are pockets of the world where renewables right now is not perceived as good investment, but that's not due to the technology, it's probably more to the political stability of those areas. The legal frameworks has to change. I mean, we need to see EU, for instance, or the US actually set up much lower local boundaries for how to transition into renewables in order to accelerate this at a level. It should be easy and simple, not complicated and complex. Then the acceleration of the corporate uptake needs to meet this challenge, both from own and supply chain emissions. We normally see corporates focusing on their own emissions, but the fact is that their supply chain is usually the biggest offender in their value chain. And especially if you look at the apparel industry, which I believe is moving ahead right now, ahead of everyone else. There are good business cases, there are good methodologies being developed to actually access your supply chain, and something that we're quite focused on at Act Renewable as well. And then we have to unlock the renewable potential for thousands of companies and not just the hundreds that are out there doing it today. And then back to you, Mark.
Great, thanks Rasmus. A lot of ground cover there and a lot of questions we've had through already. If you've got one and you haven't submitted it, please do so via the chat function. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll try and cover as many as we can. So look, so a lot of these coming in around PPAs. So what kind of profile should a company have to fit well with a PPA? And where PPAs aren't available, should other options then be considered as sort of less ideal or suboptimal?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the biggest inhibitor for PPAs is that it requires a certain legislation where you're able to unbundle the actual power from the certificates, and especially in Southeast Asia, that is a challenge because a lot of the power supply is monopolized and therefore it is retired. Even in countries like Germany, where we are based, is that if you take a subsidy if a developer takes a subsidy when developing a project, well, the utility actually takes the certificate, and therefore in order to create a PPA, you either have to be post a subsidy, to say, period, or you have not to take the subsidy, which also drives the business case. But what kind of profile should the corporate have? If we're looking at the corporates, is that the characteristics of the PPA is that it's always long-term, and you're locking yourself in as a company on a certain amount of energy at a certain price. So that means that you will use a PPA to cover your base load, so you don't end up in a situation where you have procured energy which you can't consume. So in order to be safe, you would probably stay at your base load level or even a little bit below your base load level. Secondly, is that because it's between 7 to 20 years, what we're looking at the moment, sort of average around 10 to 15 years, is that very few companies actually understand what their energy consumption is. If you're a manufacturing company, that could be the automotive industry, what's happening in 10 years from now. That is also why that the companies that we are seeing that are heavily engaging in PPAs are the ones that has very large data centers, because the data centers has a perfect load. It runs 24/7. And companies like Google know that they are doubling their energy consumption every 5 years at the moment, which means that they will never run out of demand for renewable energy, and that's why it's such a perfect fit for them. I think corporate should be careful with PPAs. It is engaging at the moment into something which is rather complex. So you got to have, I would say, renewable energy as a top spend on your list to fit it, and you got to have resources to actually go in and negotiate those. So stability, high energy demand, and an understanding of energy procurement to do PPAs.
Okay, here's a good one. So this kind of picks up on your previous points. It all sounds quite complicated. A lot of big companies making big commitments. Can you start small and transition more incrementally and still derive benefits from moving to renewables?
Yes, you can, definitely. If we're looking at it from a financial perspective, right now the return on investment on average for a solar PV rooftop, which will potentially cover like 15% of your demand, is somewhere between 4 and 7, 8 years. So the business case for smaller assets has come down, and I think it's important that you start with the things that you start with a good success. So before you dive into spending 3 years negotiating a PPA deal, maybe you want to do something else which sort of signals that you're on the right move, that you try and build out a plan. And you could easily even just, if you were looking at unbundled certificates, if you have mapped out what your quality criteria are, I mean, you can cover smaller offices that way, and you can do it in a good and credible way. So yes, I definitely believe that's possible.
Okay, and kind of linked to that, and part of your answer in the first question. So for a lot of businesses, electricity is kind of not a major business consideration. So how does a company that has a low electricity intensity but is then present across large geographies source renewable energy in a credible way?
Yes, that is a challenge at the moment, to be honest. And I think one of the things we're looking at is to do that scale. To be very frank at the moment, I think EAC portfolios is probably the best opportunity at the moment. So you go out and source them on behalf of that. But what many corporates don't like about these EAC options is that EACs are generally perceived as not being as good as other options. So what we are looking at the same time is also understanding if there is opportunities for being cross-border and aggregated. So if a company has a lot of offices around a region, would those actually be enough to potentially invest in your own project and then somehow transition those green attributes to your offices based on the one project? That will gain you additionality for sure, but right now it's challenged with some of the reporting guideline, which basically wants you to procure renewable energy in the same country as where it is. So it is a challenge at the moment to do it, but I believe that within very few years, we will see more aggregation opportunities. We will see cross-border PPAs, micro PPAs, which hopefully will be in favor for those low-intensive companies that has like a retail company, for instance, or a global law firm or something that has a lot of smaller offices with few people at each station, that there is an option for them also to invest directly.
Okay, and trying to squeeze in one or two more. So this again on the theme of different market sectors. So a lot of early movers from the tech, retail, commercial world, but kind of heavy industry, chemicals, and I can see we got a few corporations from those sectors online today. They don't appear to be moving so fast. Are they then facing different challenges, or is it kind of more difficult to start the journey there? Why aren't we seeing them moving so fast?
Yeah, it's actually a little bit of a dilemma because most of these companies are energy intensive and they know their energy game. So they know how to procure energy. So you would even suggest it should be easier for them. I think the main reason why they haven't moved yet is because they haven't sort of felt the heat yet. Many of these companies are B2B, and right now you could say the companies that are moving forward, and I think if you look at the list again of the Area 100s, I would say around 75 to 80% of them are consumer facing, so B2C segment companies. But that said, we are seeing chemical companies, medical companies, even raw material and mining companies that are now taking this in as a core part of the strategy. So I'm actually looking forward to see that some of these sectors of businesses are definitely going to move. And I think if you look at the ones that has larger plants, if you look at the mining industry as an example, they do actually have space available to do this, and they even have the opportunities to do some off-grid solutions that others don't have because they use a lot of energy and are in remote locations. So in that respect, renewable energy is actually quite a good fit.
Okay, I think that's us out of time. Questions still coming in, so we will try and pick up with those individually offline. So I think that just remains for me to say thank you to Rasmus and thank you to everyone who's joined this morning. You will get a copy of the webinar. We'll also upload a copy onto our YouTube channel, and also do please follow us on LinkedIn to keep up to date on all the topics that we've discussed this morning. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Mark.